Okay, I've been asked first to engage in the uncomfortable exercise of introducing myself. My name is Gerald Gamm. I have been a professor in the political science department at the University of Rochester now for 30 years. I served 13 years as chair of the department, and I, for nearly the entirety of that time, counted Dick and Nancy as incredibly close and good friends. Truro became just a wonderful retreat once a summer for many years. And Dick was just such a wonderful mentor and guide to me. Early on, I realized that I wanted to write a book on the United States Senate, which is fortunately pretty much done now. And that's largely because, delivering the manuscript in a month or two. And that's pretty much because of Dick and his influence. It's my privilege today to introduce Josh Shapiro. So, Josh, like me, showed up at Rochester about 30 years ago. Josh showed up, if I'm remembering this correctly, and I can actually see Josh right here, as you can see him behind me. If I'm remembering this correctly, Josh showed up from Pennsylvania, planning to become a doctor, yes, and to become a basketball player. Am I right? And Josh quickly decided that his strengths might not lie in medicine and basketball. And so as a backup career, Josh got involved in politics. Josh, when I arrived as a new professor at Rochester, Josh had just gotten himself elected president of the Students Association at Rochester and was at the time the first, and probably to this day is the only person to have been elected president as a first-year student. Josh went on to become active in the Washington semester program. He graduated from Rochester magna cum laude, won the department's J. Birdsall Prize. It's one of the best choices we ever made for the Birdsall Prize because it's given to the senior with the greatest commitment to actually getting involved in politics. Josh graduated from Rochester, spent the next 8 years in Washington. He worked on Capitol Hill for various members of the House and the Senate. In his spare time, while he was a staffer, he went to law school. He earned his JD from Georgetown Law in 2002, and then in 2003 decided to return home to the Philadelphia area where he grew up. He was elected in 2004 to the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, where he was only the second Democrat elected from the town of Abington since World War I. He was reelected 3 times. He then became a member of the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. On the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners, he became part of the first Democratic majority in the Montgomery County Board ever. And then in 2016, Josh ran for Attorney General and was elected Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As Attorney General, he spent 2 years investigating child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. His investigation led ultimately to a grand jury report that involved 1,000 victims and hundreds of priests. And more recently, as Attorney General, Josh has been dealing with the aftermath of the 2020 election. You may recall such events as November 7th, 4 days after the election, when Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York City, held a press conference at what is now famous Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a small business in Philadelphia. The event was held at Four Seasons Total Landscaping at the company's garage door and parking lot to discuss the status of the Trump campaign's legal challenges to the process of ballot counting in the state. The issue was that Trump had led in the early ballot counts in Pennsylvania, but once all the absentee ballots had been counted, Biden had won the state. Josh, as Attorney General of Pennsylvania, of the largest of the swing states, oversaw and won at least 40 cases of alleged voter fraud brought against the state after President Biden's win of the state. Josh, 2 weeks ago, won the Democratic nomination to be governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That election will be in November. It is such a pleasure to invite my old friend and somebody who has actually exemplified the values of the Birdsall Prize, Josh Shapiro.
Hey, Professor Gamm, thank you so very much. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. And I want to begin by apologizing for appearing virtually. Just given some scheduling issues, I called Professor Gam sort of in a panic, or reached out in a panic, that I did not want to cancel, both because of my immense respect for Professor Gam, my love for the University of Rochester, and my deep appreciation for the impact Dick Fenno has had on my life. And so I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to at least appear virtually here today. And I want to, particularly given the fact that it's virtual, I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to engage back and forth. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks fairly limited so we have plenty of time for questions. And I invite Professor Gam and all of you to ask me whatever questions are on your mind so we can have a good discussion. Let me maybe actually start where Professor Gam began his introduction of me, talking about my ill-fated basketball career at U of R and pre-med, but he omitted one very important part of the story. And so let me begin there. He is 100% correct that I came to, Professor Gam, if you could just let me know y'all can still hear me. I lost your signal, but I want to make sure you're still hearing me.
So Josh, we can hear you fine.
Great.
Stop calling me Professor Gam.
Okay.
It's making me super uncomfortable. Do you want me to start calling you Attorney General Shapiro?
All right, you got it. I will call you Gerald if that's okay. Look, here's what I will tell you. I came to the U of R because I learned from a very early age that you had to help other people. I learned that from the teachings of my faith, and I learned that from the example that my parents set for me. My dad still is the local pediatrician to seemingly every kid in our community, and I watched him help kids and make them all better. And my mom was a public school teacher, an educator, and very active in community issues. And so through them and through my faith, I learned the importance of serving others. And I really felt that when it was time to go to college, the way I would serve others, quite frankly, was to do it through medicine. And U of R had an incredible pre-med program. I imagine they still do. And I came, it was my freshman year. I was doing all the pre-med courses. And I was also playing on the men's basketball team. It was very early on in the process. And one day, my freshman year, true story, I went to one of my pre-med classes. It was a big lecture hall. And afterwards, the professor asked me to come down and speak to him. As I recall, the class was calculus. And I came down to speak to him, and he very gently handed me my exam back. I vividly remember that the exam was out of 165 points. I vividly remember that you got 2 points for writing your TA's name correct. And the score I received was a 4, like 4 total points out of 165. And my professor, who was a lovely guy, said, look, it is clear to me you studied. It is also clear to me that you do not understand this subject matter. And the truth is, I really did study, and I really didn't understand the subject matter, and I really didn't enjoy it. And I remember feeling pretty down, but I knew that I was going to play basketball and it would be okay. And so I sort of delayed the call I was going to make to my father, the physician, to tell him that I would not live out my life's dream of being the first NBA playing physician. So I go to the basketball practice, have practice, and then Coach Mike Neer, who was our really, fine coach at the time, Gerald remembers him, called me to his office after practice to tell me that I had been cut from the team. So within a span of a few hours, all of my dreams at the U of R had died. Called my father, hey, Pop, I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be a doctor like you. And by the way, I'm also not going to be in the NBA. You all can't see me, but if I were there, you would note I'm about Gerald's height and I'm a Jewish guy. And so I had a lot working against me on my basketball playing career. But anyway, my pop said to me, listen, you do whatever you love. You find your passion and I'll be proud of you, which was the best advice any parent could give. And frankly, the way Lori and I are trying to raise our 4 children. A couple hours later, and this is the part that Gerald did not mention, I was living in Tiernan Hall, and someone knocked on my dorm room door and said, we have elections coming up for the Student Senate. We need a representative from this, cohort. I forget exactly what the cohort was, and you should run. And I said, why would I ever want to do that? And he said, well, you're having a pretty shitty day and you got nothing going for you. So maybe this could be an option. And I ran and I won. And I got very involved in student government. And ultimately, as Gerald said, fell in love with that and ran for student body president at the end of my freshman year and defeated a bunch of juniors and won. I share that story with you because that was a pivotal moment in my life. I experienced a lot of failure that day, but I also was able to see some opportunity. In part, I think because of my own, construct as a person, but in large measure because of the opportunities that presented themselves to me at U of R. As I got more engaged in student government, I actually found that I loved the process of politics and advocacy. And I began to study political science. I remember going up the steps in the political science building. I don't know if it's still in the same place. And Gerald at the time was a brand new professor, and he was in this real small office right at the top of the steps. I imagine you got the big corner office now, but I remember meeting him, and I remember getting to know some of my professors. And I remember being really curious about a guy who had an office in the building there, who I kept hearing his name, Dick Fenno, who didn't really teach undergrads, focused most of his work on his own research and on graduate students. And as I began to take the classes, many of the books on the wall here are still from those classes that I took. People joke with me when they see me on TV. They're like, did you read all those books? I'm like, I read the 25% of them from U of R. Lori, my wife, read the other 75% that are behind us. But I began to get to know these professors and take these classes. And the name Fenno and Riker kept showing up in all of our textbooks. The way they helped us learn to study politics and political science in a totally new way, the way they broke new ground. And it got me curious. And so one day I stopped by his office hours. Now remember, I had no classes with him. He didn't teach undergrad, but I stopped by and he was willing to talk to me. And I found myself, and I know you all have people in your lives like this, I found myself just wanting to listen, to not talk, to ask some questions to spur on a conversation, but to just listen. And he became a real mentor to me and encouraged me at the end of my sophomore year, when I was serving as student body president, to consider the next year doing the Washington semester program. Now, I was loving what I was doing in student government and planned to run for reelection. And remember, we never had a student body president run for reelection because it was always a senior, right? So you didn't have the opportunity to run for reelection. And I listened to Professor Fenno and decided I would forego running for reelection and instead go to Washington, D.C. and see if this love of advocacy through both student government and my studies would turn into a love of actually a career in public service, in politics. Professor Fenno encouraged me to apply for the program, got into the program. And I remember he had 2 rules at the time. One was, you can't work for your own member of Congress, because he wanted you to apply. He wanted you to earn your position as an intern in the office. And second, he wanted to hear about your experience when you got back, to talk to him, to tell him what you learned. I immersed myself in that program. It was the most pivotal, 5-6 months of my life. And ultimately, by the way, it led me to working for that senator, Senator Carl Levin, the day after I graduated college. I went back and began my career in public service down there. But before I get to that, I want to tell you that when I returned, I begged Professor Fenno to let me work with him on writing a thesis. Now, he really didn't do that for undergrads, but it was important to me that he be my what do you call it? My mentor, my guide through this thesis. And I dug it out of the attic, actually. I have it right here. It's very long. And I wrote about Senate Bill 349, which was a bill when I was working in the Senate, the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1994. And it was important to me to write about it because I'm someone who is focused now my career as a public servant, but I had a keen interest back then in how can we bring more integrity to the process and ensure that the voters and the constituents get heard and not just the fancy lobbyists who are roaming the halls of the Capitol. I remember sitting there answering the telephones in the senator's office and seeing a lot more lobbyists roll in as opposed to the constituents. And so I wrote this very, very long thesis in Courier font and had the opportunity to work with Professor Fenno on that. And I will tell you that that was the most enriching experience that I had as a student, having the chance to learn at his knee and have the chance to really find myself and my passion. And I learned under some great professors. I would say this behind his back if he weren't here, under Gerald Gamm, under Professor Mueller, under several others who taught me a lot. But Professor Fenno really, for me, was someone who set me on this course of service that I'm in. He also helped me be in Washington at a pretty pivotal moment, a moment where Newt Gingrich had taken over the Capitol. The contract with America had, sort of guided the policies. Things started to get more divisive and more partisan at that time. And so I feel like I kind of began my career in public service at a moment where we started to see some greater divisions. And it's one of the things that I've worked very hard throughout my career to address. I want to share one story with you, that happened many years later, and then I'll yield the floor to Gerald for some questions. I took that experience with Gerald at the U of R, with Professor Fenno at the U of R, my Washington semester, and it led me to literally driving to DC the day after I graduated to then begin a career working on the Hill. And Gerald is correct. While I was working on the Hill, Lori and I put me through Georgetown Law School at night. I earned a law degree and then ultimately came back home and ran for the state House of Representatives. I'm a Democrat. I ran in an overwhelmingly Republican district, knocked on 18,000 doors and earned a seat in the state House. And one of the first meetings I had in Harrisburg was a dinner one night with a guy from York, Pennsylvania, or just outside York, Pennsylvania, who was interested in getting more involved in politics and a little bit more involved in, sort of the policy in Pennsylvania. And we had this incredible dinner where all we did was talk about policy, not politics at all. And he wanted to meet me because he had received his doctorate from MIT in poli-sci. And he studied Dick Fenno. And he knew that I had this connection to Dick Fenno, and all he wanted to do was understand for me what Dick was really like, because he never had the chance to meet him. And we probably spent 2 hours at dinner, 15 of which was about, sort of the politics of the day in Pennsylvania. The other hour and 45 minutes was all about Dick Fenno. And the dinner ended and we agreed to stay in touch. And over the years, had many more conversations about Dick Fenno and the incredible political science department at the University of Rochester. That man's name is Tom Wolf. He is now the governor of Pennsylvania. Wow. And he is someone who also indirectly learned from Dick Fenno and applied that here in Pennsylvania. God willing, in a few months, I will succeed him. And it is not a stretch to say that Dick Fenno will have impacted the last two governors of Pennsylvania, good policy in the Commonwealth, and good outcomes for the good people of Pennsylvania. People ask me all the time, why do you do what you do? And how did you get here? I get that question a lot as I travel around Pennsylvania. And I speak very plainly, and that is that I am motivated by my family. Lori and I have 4 amazing children. I look in their eyes every day, and I just want the world to be a little bit better for them. I am guided by my faith, which teaches me, my scripture teaches me that no one is required to complete the task, but neither are we free to refrain from it. Meaning I believe, and I'm not asking you to subscribe to my beliefs, but I believe that each of us has a responsibility to get off the sidelines, get in the game, and do our part. So it is family, it is faith, and it is Fenno, because I would not be here today but for the impact that that man had on my life. And I suppose you could also add to that list Coach Mike Neer and whoever the hell was the calculus professor who flunked me and kicked me off the team that day and led me into Dick Fenno's arms. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to salute your service through the work you've done with the Washington Semester and the Political Science Department. And I'm really anxious to hear what's on your mind and take your questions. And if you don't have any questions, I'd be happy to just begin reading my thesis to you and we could have a discussion about that afterwards. It's only, I don't know, 140 pages or so. Anyway, thank you all very much. Gerald, I'll turn the floor back to you.
Okay, so Josh, I'm just going to say,
thank you.
I just want to begin by saying what a delight it is to see you and to hear from you. And I'm assuming this is not a typical stump speech that you're going out on the road with.
No.
No. It said so much about Rochester and about the Washington Semester Program and about your relationship with Dick. And I even heard details today that I didn't know about, like the thesis and how long it was.
Yes.
So I'm going to start off just by seeding questions and answers with a question you've already seen. I want to start by thanking Larry Rothenberg, who I think drafted these questions. And you've already responded to a number of them in your opening remarks.
Sure.
So a lot of them you've already answered. So I'm going to jump to one. And then based on some rogue texting that you and I were just doing, I'm going to open it up to the room to ask you other questions. And if things get slow, I have more of these questions here.
Okay.
And the understanding that Josh and I have is that he will not respond to any questions that are sharply divisive, that could cause him problems, or that are very, very much about the politics of the moment with his governor's race. But he said it's okay to ask reasonable questions, including about the governor's race, and we just have to respect he might not answer every question. Is that fair?
There you go. It's totally fine. And if my staff gets angry, they can be angry with you, not me. So
his staff was texting the organizers of the conference, stick to the pre-assigned questions. As Josh is telling me, ignore my staff, I'm okay. But our deal is Josh has every right to say he's not comfortable with the question. So Josh, the first question, and I hope you're comfortable with this one. You already talked about the time period you were in Congress.
Yeah.
Or that you were a staffer in Congress.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you were there as a college student in probably 93, 94, and 94.
94,
Newt Gingrich and the Republicans gain a majority in Congress in November of 94 and take control of Congress in January of 95. Dick Fenno, in fact, wrote a book. It's a thin book, but it's a wonderful book about what it was like for Republicans to govern Congress, having been out of the majority for 40 years.
Yeah.
So you've already reflected, you've already talked about that things became more divisive once Gingrich became Speaker. My question, and here I'm channeling Larry, is how do you think Dick Fenno would think about Congress today? Is Dick observed Congress throughout his career from the 1950s through the early 21st century, and as a place where Democrats and Republicans talk together and work together, where when he described the Appropriations Committee, it was the people on the Appropriations Committee against the rest of the House. As Dick was a scholar who was equally comfortable with Democrats and Republicans, how would Dick navigate the world today? How would Dick react to the world today? Would his optimism and hopefulness still be there?
Look, and far be it from me to kind of ascribe to Dick how he would feel, but you asked the question, I'll sort of go out on a limb and say, one of the things that I think allowed him to always be hopeful was he knew that there was some drama and theatrics that had to go on in our politics, but he also kind of relished the back room where the real work got done. And he thought that that was an important part of the system. And it seems to me that that back room doesn't really exist anymore and doesn't work very well. And that I think he would lament the impact that Twitter and fundraising and dark money has had on the process. And I think he would lament that there is not an ability to find that sort of conscious middle that always really existed before and is much harder to find today. I also think, like me, he would lament the fact that there's not a lot of courage anymore, and there aren't many good leaders. By the way, I'm a Democrat. I don't think there's many good Democratic leaders, and certainly not many good Republican leaders. And I think that would disappoint him. One of the things that, and Gerald, you understand this way better than I do, but one of the things that he was so known for was an ability to put more science and statistic and predictability behind the conduct of the Congress. That doesn't exist anymore because they consistently make irrational decisions. Many of them who are there today aided and abetted a violent insurrection against our government. And they have been rewarded politically for that. And that there is no logic behind that. There's no science that I think even someone as talented as Dick Fenno could sort of point to as an explanation and a rationalization for that type of treasonous conduct. And so I think he would lament a lot of where we are, our inability to get big things done in Washington, the divisiveness that exists, the presence of dark money and the way it pollutes the process, and the lack of a back room to make meaningful change in.
So Josh, I'm going to ask a follow-up, then I'm going to open up to the room.
Mm-hmm.
My follow-up is, you say politicians are irrational, and yet you said politicians who supported the insurrection on January 6th were rewarded for it.
Yes.
So isn't that rational to engage in behavior, to endorse behavior, even if it's violent and anti-democratic behavior, if it's going to reward you politically and help you get reelected?
It is rational, but it is profoundly weak. And let me explain what I mean by that. It used to be that we all lived by the same rules. We love America, we support democracy, but then we're going to argue like hell about what the tax rate should be, or what the foreign policy should be, or whether we should have universal health care. And those were the healthy debates that perfected our union. And I didn't always agree with the outcome, but it was an outcome that could be trusted because it was based on a few set values that we could all share and agree with. When you decide that you are willing to sell out our democracy and sell out our Constitution to get a short-term political gain, Gerald, you could call that rational because you're saying to yourself, if you're one of those politicians, if I do this, I get reelected, it's rational to want to keep your paycheck. But I would argue that you have a higher standard you have to work in when you're taking an oath of office to the Constitution of the United States. And at its basic level, you've got to honor the Constitution. And so the reason why I say it's profoundly weak and not rational is because you are saying that you're willing to sell out the very institution that you took an oath to, the document that you swore to uphold and protect, in order to help you get through the next election. And to me, those people who do that need to be defeated. And the reason why they need to be defeated is not just because of me, the Democrat, saying that about a Republican. Some of you who disagree with my politics could chalk it up to that. But I would ask you to not. I would ask you to understand the reason why I say that is not because I'm suggesting they must be replaced by a Democrat. That might be my preference. It might not be some of yours, but rather because as an institution, we cannot reward treasonous behavior like that because it makes us all weaker and it makes it harder to then go solve the problems that we need to solve as a nation. And that is, to me, where you could call it rational maybe in the short term, but my view it is a profoundly weak and frankly pathetically weak thing that a number of members of Congress and senators have engaged in, including my opponent in the governor's race, who breached the police lines and was at the Capitol on January the 6th. And he's been rewarded in the short term by winning the Republican nomination for governor. Now, I don't think he's going to win the general election, but that is something that I think we all have to think long and hard about. Do we want to reward that behavior? Because if we decide we want to reward that behavior, what we're really saying is we're going to undermine the Constitution.
Well, it's interesting too that you call it short-term rational, because as you were talking, I was thinking the same logic that would drive people in 2020 to say that Mike Pence can effectively decide which electoral votes to count.
Right.
Means that presumably Kamala Harris has the right to decide the next election, which maybe seems short-term rational in 2020, but those people are obviously not going to believe that argument in 2024.
Right. No, and look, I mean, I think what we learned, you really asked this, but I'm going to go there. What we learned in 2020 is that the kind of institutional, not niceties, it's more than niceties, but the institutional kind of standards that we all accepted, right? Like,
let's call them norms, rules,
guardrails, whatever you want to call them, that Washington and the Congress would no longer adhere to that, right? I mean, I do not believe for a minute if, what's his name, the guy who's the Republican leader, McCarthy or whatever his name is from the House, if he and McConnell were in charge, I do not believe that they would have respected those norms. And I'm going to give you some proof for that. Minutes after the Capitol was cleared, police died, blood was shed. The 8 Republican members of Congress from Pennsylvania, who had just been reelected on the same ballot, stepped through the broken glass, went to the floor of the House of Representatives, and objected to Pennsylvania's electoral votes on the floor of the House of Representatives. Think about that for a minute. The same ballots that returned them, that allowed them to even stand there that day at the microphone, they were objecting to. I do not believe that the guardrails are any more respected in Washington, D.C. The truth is, the story of the 2020 election and why our democracy continued is because of 2 handfuls of state actors, governors, attorneys general, and secretaries of state from a handful of states, and a whole bunch of Republican and Democratic election clerks from all across this country said that they were going to put democracy before partisanship. That's why we still have a nation. That's why we still have a democracy. And it is under attack again in these midterms. And it's way more dangerous now because there's a lot more people in the arena who subscribe to those treasonous beliefs.
Thank you, Josh. I'm now going to open up to the room. And as Josh just signaled, there are a broad range of things you can ask him questions about. You can ask about his time as a basketball player, his time in the Washington semester program, time in the state legislature, his time as attorney general, his time in the Montgomery Board of Commissioners. So I'm opening up to the group. I have the microphone, so raise your hand. Yes, and identify yourself and your question.
My name is Bob Carriger, a 77 graduate from the U of R, also played basketball. Did you know that Mike Neer grew up in Alexandria, Virginia? That's a little fact. But anyway, no, I wanted to ask how...
I lost you guys there for about 30 seconds. So if I could just ask you to go back to the beginning of your question.
Okay, my name is Bob Carriger. I'm a 77 graduate of the U of R, also played hoops And Mike Neer grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river.
Wow. Well, if you see him, tell him I'm not pissed anymore. It's okay.
No. I know. But anyway, you had mentioned that you interned through the program with Senator Carl Levin from Michigan, and was wondering how you applied and got the internship with Levin, and also tell us a little bit about what type of a senator was Carl Levin.
Professor Fenno made us put together a list of senators and representatives who we might have an interest in working for. And again, the only rule was it couldn't be your own senator or congressman. And I was really struck by Carl's leadership on foreign policy, which was an area of interest to me. I was struck that he had earned a reputation about being a real like bipartisan guy. He could get a lot done. And even though he was, pretty left of center, he worked really well with guys on the and ladies on the right. And so that was just like attractive to me. I thought that was really interesting. And literally, Professor Fenno had us go to the Hill. I walked the halls and I knocked on the doors and did my interviews and got a few offers. And I just thought that would be the right place for me. I quickly learned that my job was going to be answering telephones, and the phones never stopped ringing. And to me, that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my public service career, because I heard from people. And if you filter out the people who were just kind of program type callers, and you really could learn what was on people's minds. And every so often, Carl would come out and ask me, what were people calling about? And I was given the opportunity to talk to the senator and tell him what it was that was on people's minds. I learned that he showed up in the office very early in the morning, like 7 o'clock in the morning. And yet we weren't supposed to get there till 9 o'clock in the morning. And so I started showing up at 7 in the morning, just so I could have the opportunity to be in the office with him. And he had this like kind of more private office down the hall. And so he would let me between 7 and 9 a.m. answer the phone in his private office until his, whatever she was called, his personal assistant got there at 9 a.m. And we would talk. And I would study the issues of the day. And I would always feel like I understood them and that I could carry on a conversation with him. And the thing I learned from him the most was from the experience we had between 7 and 9 a.m. in those mornings, where he would every single day ask me a question that I was completely unprepared to answer. And through asking a question of me that I was unprepared to answer, even though I felt that I was studying up on these issues and this and that, I learned how to be prepared. I learned how to ask probing questions of my staff in a respectful way, obviously. And I learned how to be a prepared public servant. Now, there's a lot of other things you learn from a guy like that, how to act ethically and with integrity and all that. But to me, his ability to ask questions that I'd never thought of the answer was probably the most valuable thing I learned. And I think if you asked the staff I've worked with over the years, I right now, obviously in the AG's office, I employ 1,000 people. I deal with a lot of folks, although I will tell you, my senior staff throughout my career has largely remained unchanged. I've got a very loyal team and I'm loyal to them. And I think they would tell you that they probably get frustrated sometimes when I ask them questions they've not thought about an answer to. And although they're incredible at anticipating that now, and that is all from Carl Levin. So I think not only did I benefit from that, but my staff today benefits from those lessons I learned from Carl Levin. Quick side story. I remember one time he asked me a question about a bill that was coming up on abortion. And it was a bill that would be characterized as anti-choice. So I knew he was going to vote no, right? And so he asked me, Senate bill, whatever it was called, can you tell me about this? And my answer was, we're against this. We're voting no on this. And not that he got mad, but he said, but that's not the question I asked you. I asked you about the bill and the underlying issue and what it was about. And really, when a United States senator of his stature says that to you, you realize like, yeah, I mean, you're sort of right that we're against it, but that's not all he wanted to know. He wanted to go deeper. He wanted to have a better understanding. And it was interactions like that that taught me to be a better questioner, a better listener, a better researcher, and someone who sought out, answers in a deeper way than just the superficial, we're for it or we're against it. I'd say that's what I learned the most from him.
Thanks, Josh.
Governor Shapiro, nice to meet you. Jamal Holtz, I'm speaking into existence. Jamal
Thanks.
Holtz.
Appreciate your optimism, man. Thank you.
My name is Jamal Holtz, class of 2020. I also served as student body president. I never understood why people used to say I remind them of you. People like Dana Perrin, who spoke highly of you all the time. Yeah.
That's so cool. Are you a crappy basketball player too, or?
I think I'll leave that story for another day. I'm 6'4", but doesn't mean that I know how to play.
Oh, I am not 6'4", so okay.
But my question is sort of the understanding of the filibuster, and you talk a lot about democracy and the future of our democracy. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the filibuster from your learnings and teachings from when you were a student at the University of Rochester, and sort of where we are today, and sort of what the future of the filibuster should be?
It's a great question. When I learned about the filibuster, and frankly, when I saw it back in the 90s, it was used as a tool to slow things down, which I would argue is a good thing in institutions of government. But it was not used as a tool to impede progress. So you get everybody kind of like slow the roll, lower the passion, lower the temperature, but then it would force the senators to come together and work out a compromise. As the years went on into the early 2000s, it became very clear that the filibuster, which by the way, isn't really a filibuster because they don't have to stand up and talk and occupy the floor. It's sort of a joke at this point, how it is used, is really just used to stop anything from happening and used for purely partisan purposes. And by the way, again, I'm a proud Democrat. It's being used by Republicans for partisan purposes now, and it will be used by Democrats for partisan purposes. So I think it's an equal opportunity thing. And I believe that it is really undemocratic. I think it is a relic of a time when our institutions were used to put forth racist policies, policies that held women back, policies that were, quite frankly, not the vision that I would have for this country or the direction that I think we need to go. And I think it makes it impossible to address big issues, from gun violence to climate to social justice issues. And it is my view, which I would tell you is completely meaningless. I've been asked to run for the Senate twice, and I've declined both times because I don't have an interest in going and doing that work. But it is my view that the filibuster is a relic of the past and should immediately be done away with. And you're going to live or die by that decision. Sometimes as a Democrat, you're going to be in charge, and sometimes you're going to be in the minority. And while it may force things to move a little quicker and lose some of that slowdown that I think historically has been helpful to kind of calm people's nerves and make reasonably good policy, the truth is it is just being used to stymie all kinds of progress right now. And that to me is something that is not worth holding on to. And it is not the intended purpose, I think, of those who envisioned it early on in our nation.
Hi, I'm Alan Dubin, class of 1973, and a proud graduate of Scranton Central High School, 1969. Hey. If I hadn't escaped, I would be one of your constituents now. So this is really about your constituents. Let's assume that Jamal's salutation to you comes true and you're the governor. And let's talk about the constituents of those 8 Republicans that you mentioned before. How are you going to connect with them?
There are you have a job when you get elected to be the chief executive of the Commonwealth or of any state. And that is to try and protect the safety and welfare of the people of your state, and to try and make some progress on the things that you think are important. I think you also have a responsibility to stay true to your values and the values that you espouse when you're asking people for their support. So my view, for example, is that I will never compromise on the issue of protecting a woman's right to choose. I'll never compromise on marriage equality. I'll never compromise on voting rights, in the sense that I will never sign a bill that takes away people's voting rights, or takes away marriage equality, or takes away a woman's right to make decisions over her own body. And I respect the fact that there's some people in this room that may disagree with my views on those things. My view is that if you're open and transparent about that, and you're willing to be aware of the politics and the theatrics that goes on in our business. Republicans in the legislature are going to send me a bill banning abortion. They're going to have their press conferences. I'm going to veto it. I'm going to have my press conferences. I'm going to defend reproductive freedom. And then the issue is, do we move on from that and work in the areas where we can make progress? How we educate our kids, public safety, growing the economy, just 3 examples. Or do we hold a grudge and say, I'm never going to work with those people because they have a fundamentally different view than I do on abortion rights, for example. And my view is I have a responsibility to work with people, even those I have profound disagreements with, and to find common ground. And my view is there is a lot of common ground to find on those areas, education, public safety, the economy, for example. And that if I can enter a conversation, even with my fiercest political opponent, recognizing that there's 10 things we're going to do, and knowing that the real debate is whether you get 5 and I get 5, or I get 6 and you get 4 of those 10 things. The reality is I'm going to give a little bit, they're going to give a little bit, and we are going to get some things done in those areas where we can still find some common ground. I think the politicians who choose to say, because I disagree with you on this particular issue, and sort of force people to take a purity test, and if you don't, meet that purity test, I'm never going to work with you. I'm never going to engage with you. Well, my view is, like, it's fine if you hold those views, but then don't hold these positions in government, because we're trusted with these positions to actually get some things done. May disagree on exactly what the parameters of those things are, but you got a responsibility to govern and to work together. So I profoundly disagree with those people that you talked about, but I got a responsibility to pave our roads and educate our kids and ensure moms can walk their kids down the street, not get shot. And I'm going to work with anybody I can to find some common ground to get those things done.
Can you hear Micah? Josh, can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
Now I
Okay,
can't
great.
see you, but I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. So my name is Micah Greenberg. I am a class of 2021 grad, so pretty recent. I was also involved in student government. I was speaker when Jamal was president. I was in charge of elections at one point, so I was the person who would be knocking on the doors to get people to run like you did. I guess my question is, you talked about Professor Fenno relishing in the back room, and sort of you spoke positively about that, about being important to get things done, but at the same time you talked about sort of the negative sentiment towards dark money and lobbyists and those sorts of things. And I think that there is kind of a contrast there, but I'm sort of wondering how you balance those. And I'm not trying to say that this is like a gotcha question. I think there's merit in both, but like, how do you balance the sort of backroom dealing with the importance of things being like out in the open?
Well, look, I mean, you got to have transparency in the process, but it doesn't mean that every conversation you're having needs to be done on Twitter or needs to be done in the public square. And in fact, I'm a believer in total transparency once you're able to make some progress on those things, whether it's a case, in my case as Attorney General, or it's on, obviously I have a lot more limitations on what I can share, but those things that I can share publicly, or whether you're legislating and trying to get a bill passed. I mean, part of the problem, I think, with our politics today is everybody's so quick to run to MSNBC and Fox News and talk about what they're doing as opposed to actually doing the damn work. And it requires us to get in a room sometimes and close the door and say, look, we got to work together. We got to trust one another. And then when it's done, we can all run and claim credit. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I certainly understand. I don't know that all electeds understand is like, it's okay for your opponents to get some credit. In fact, when I'm in the midst of a negotiation, I'm always thinking about how can I help this guy across the table from me get some credit when it's over, because otherwise he's not going to engage with me. He's not going to want to work with me to get something done. So I want to help him get those five. Remember my example of the 10 things? I want to help him get his 5 things or his 4 things. I always try and get 6 if they're going to get 4. But I want to help them get what they want and speak to their constituency that may be different than mine. And I think it's hard to do that on Twitter, and it's hard to do that on cable news. And I think you gotta have some rooms where you can work and operate, where you can create a level of trust between the people on each side of the aisle to know that, you know, the handshake is going to matter and you're going to be able to get that bill done or get that issue resolved, whatever the case may be. I do a lot of negotiations in cases, obviously, as Attorney General. Criminal ones are subject to lots of secrecy rules, so we'll put that aside. But on the civil side, the lawyers who deal with me and my staff know they can have a very honest, open discussion with us in our conference room or on the phone. It's not going to get out. But when it's done, I'm going to have a press conference. I'm going to answer questions. I'm going to be beholden to the public and be transparent. But I don't think like just because you're having negotiations in private means you're not transparent. I think we have to understand that there's such a rush to get to Twitter and such a rush to get to cable news and to demand this transparency. And I think we sacrifice progress a lot in conducting when people conduct themselves that way.
So we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay.
There are 3 people with their hands up in a row. I don't know who to choose.
Pick all 3 and I'll give quick answers.
Okay, all 3.
Yeah.
Hi, Grace Scarborough, class of 1980 and PhD 1984. I'm wondering if you think there's any way forward on gun safety, gun control.
I think there is at the state level. I don't have much faith in our federal officials to pass anything because of the question. I think it was Jamal who asked me a question about the filibuster. I'm not saying I agree with that. I wish I was wrong, but I think that's the reality.
Hi, my name is Nina Agarwal, class of 94, and I actually remember voting for you when you ran for student body president. And
Thank you for your vote. I hope you live in Pennsylvania now.
If you give me a job in Pennsylvania, I'll be happy to move there. And I'm also trying to become a citizen so I can vote. So that would be a double bonus.
There you go.
And I certainly would love to be able to vote for you when you run for president one day, which I know you will.
Thank you.
So
I'm ignoring the last thing you said. So.
I'm sorry?
I'm ignoring the last comment that you made.
So my question is that in my experience, most, if not all politicians have a really hard time getting beyond ideology. And sometimes that means that they don't do the right thing because of the ideology getting in the way. And so I'm just curious as to your thoughts as to why that is and what it takes to get past ideology in order to help somebody that really needs it, even though the ideology doesn't really let them do that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say I'm not totally down with you on the idea that ideology is always a problem. I mean, I'm very ideological when it comes to civil rights issues or reproductive rights, for example. And I'm very outspoken on that. And there are a bunch of people that like me for it and a bunch of people that disagree with me for it, right? I think the problem is more of like these ridiculous purity tests that politicians feel like they need to meet, that they need to be pure on every issue. They need to always be on the left or always be on the right. And it doesn't leave an opportunity for you to be maybe on the left on something and on the right on something else. I mean, I'm very proud that I think viewed as someone who can work with both sides of the aisle. Some of my views would be considered, very, very progressive. Others would be more moderate or even right of center. And by the way, I just not only won my nomination for governor as a Democrat, no one even ran against me. And so I guess the point in saying that is not to pat myself on the back, but rather to say, I think if you forego the purity test and instead focus on making progress for people, even when they disagree with your particular view on something, they reward public servants that are actually public servants, that actually work for them. And I think that discussion about ideology, to use your word, or purity, to use mine, occupies a lot of time on the airwaves, and on Twitter, but not a lot of time in the sort of thought process of the public. I'll share one quick anecdote with you. There is a community called Bradford County, Pennsylvania. Less than 100,000 people live there. We're a Commonwealth of 13 million people, so we're really big. Less than 100,000 people live in this community. I'd have to go back and look, maybe one of you can Google it, but in the 2016 presidential election, I imagine Hillary Clinton lost there 80-20 or something like that, okay? And I didn't win that county, but I did a little bit better than that. But it's not exactly an area where I'm going to enjoy a whole bunch of political support. I sued a major gas drilling company because they had gotten a bunch of leases on people's lands to drill for natural gas. It's known as fracking. And in exchange for drilling on their land, they had to pay a royalty to the landowners, basically a fee to the landowners. And I sued the company. And by the way, ultimately got all the landowners their money back. But that's not the reason I'm telling you this story. The reason I'm telling you a story is in the middle of all the litigation, which can be confusing and it's hard to understand. I said to my staff, I want to go do a town hall meeting in the local, high school gymnasium there, auditorium, whatever it was, and talk to people about what we're doing. And I remember one of my aides was like, that's not exactly an area where they love you, Josh, right? I was like, I know, but I'm there because I'm working hard for them. I want them to hear from me and tell them what's going on with the litigation. This is before we won. I give my presentation, explain to everybody, let folks know what they need to do to participate and this and that. And afterwards, this guy in the crowd looks at me, points at me and goes like this. And he's wearing one of those red, whatever they call them, the MAGA hats, and he's wearing a big Trump t-shirt. I'm like, oh, this is going to be great. So I walk over and he said, Shapiro, let me tell you something. I don't like that you keep suing my president. This is when Trump was president. I don't like your views on abortion. I don't like your views on gay rights, but I'm going to vote for you forever because you're the only damn guy that shows up here and gives a damn about me. Now, I don't know if he really voted for me again. And in some ways, it sort of doesn't matter. The sentiment that he shared is one that I wish was heard more on the cable news and on the Twitter. And that is that what that guy desired was not someone who had the same ideological views or kind of the same purity views or whatever you want to define it. He just wanted someone that was going to give a damn about him. And I think so much of what defines our broken, divisive politics amongst the electorate, I'm not talking about the elected officials now, amongst the electorate is they feel like they're getting screwed all the time. And that the elected leaders don't have their backs. And so my view is having someone's back trumps all the ideology. Now, not every time, and there's certainly people on each edge that would disagree with me. But by and large, I think that's where most good Pennsylvanians are. And I think in public service, we've got to get away from the ideological, away from the purity, staying true to our values, as I've discussed here today, but focusing on, excuse my language, Gerald, getting shit done for people and actually breaking through the frustration and showing people that government can actually work and get things done to help make people's lives better. I promised you a short answer and I gave you a long one. Sorry.
We trained you well. We taught you well, Josh.
All right. Last question.
Promise short answers, give long answers.
Just one more question. I think it builds on what you were just discussing. And my question is, this country has been rocked in the last month on the matter of reproductive rights, on the matter of gun safety. And how are the people of Pennsylvania feeling on those issues, and how will that perhaps shape the campaign ahead for you?
You know, I speak very open. Let's take reproductive rights first. I speak very openly about this issue. When I launched my campaign, first off, as AG, I've been to court, including the Supreme Court. We argued the last case that RBG heard, actually, and it was on the contraceptive mandate that President Trump tried to take away from women across this country. But I've been very upfront and outspoken on that. People know where I stand, but I've leaned in on that issue even before the opinion leaked from the Supreme Court. And since it has leaked, presuming that that is ultimately the opinion or the rough sketch of the opinion they put forth, the issue comes back to the states. What I have found before the opinion leaked is that it was interesting. It was mostly older women who lived kind of pre-Roe who would speak to me about the issue. And really, like in very emotional terms, you know, beg me not to let us go back to what it was like before Roe. And younger women didn't bring it up a lot. They were happy to know I was pro-choice, but didn't bring it up a ton. Now it is obviously a different dynamic. And I hear from women and allies every day. I've leaned in on this. I've advertised on this. This is an issue where I am certainly with the majority of Pennsylvanians. And it is an issue where my opponent is not only anti-choice, but so extreme that he would ban all abortions starting in week 1. And he would not only ban all abortions and take away the right for women to make decisions over their bodies, even when they've been raped, God forbid, or a victim of incest, he would go a step further and jail all of the doctors who perform abortions. And so his extreme views are completely out of touch, not just with Pennsylvanians, but frankly with the Republican Party. So this is an issue I will run on, and I think it is central on people's minds. I also think gun violence prevention is central on people's minds, especially, I mean, really everybody, but especially young people. They talk to me about this issue quite a bit. I think that there is some common ground we can find on red flag laws, on dealing with what I think is the biggest gun violence threat, and that is ghost guns. I've been sounding the alarm about that for the last 3 years. I think we need to make sure that there's background checks, not just on them, but universal background checks. And so I think there's some common ground we can find. My opponent believes we should be arming every math teacher to keep our kids safe. And that's the only answer. So, I mean, there are some real differences on both those issues, and I intend to continue to lean in on both of them. And I am certainly with the majority of Pennsylvanians on that. He's wildly out of touch. And so you'll hear me talking about both of those issues over the course of the next 178 days.
So Josh, just on behalf of everybody here, I want to wrap this up with a couple of Fenno related thoughts.
Great.
But before I say that, I just want to say thank you so much for being here and joining us today for this conference. It clearly matters to all of us, and I can see how much it matters to you to be here. So my two Fenno related thoughts, I'll also be quick. One is, Dick and I had this ongoing conversation for years about the nature of the Washington semester program and the fact that the program under his leadership was a full-time 40-hour-a-week internship, that there were no classes in Washington, D.C. that somebody had to take on the side. They got 16 credits just for doing the internship.
Yep.
And I would often push back and say, shouldn't they do classes? And Dick would always say, they do more than enough classes when they're in Rochester. Everybody else doing an internship on Capitol Hill is only doing the internship for 16 or 20 hours. Our interns get much better experience because they're there full time. And hearing your story about Carl Levin and you being there 7 to 9 a.m. every morning makes me understand fully for the first time what Dick meant and how that full-time immersive internship really helped to shape you. Heather Higginbottom is here today, and so many other people are here today who are products of that experience. So that's number one, the full-time internship. And number two, I traveled with Dick a couple of times down to Washington, D.C. When he flew down, he wanted to meet with the Washington interns. And one of the times he had this conversation with me and he said, there's one thing in my life I've not yet accomplished. And he said, I feel so good about myself as a teacher, and I love the scholarship I do. I love the community of Congress scholars. He took such pride in the scholars that he helped train at Rochester and the scholars that he mentored from other institutions. But he said, I don't have a student who actually serves in a major elective office. And he said, if I could have anything, it would be for somebody to be doing that. And I'm just sitting here thinking of Malik Evans, who in November was elected mayor of Rochester, and thinking of you being Attorney General and possibly the next governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And just remember that conversation with Dick and how proud he would be right now seeing you and Malik and any other students that he had who actually decided not just to study politics, but to actually do something about it. So Josh, thanks for being here. Thanks for being such a great alum and such a great friend and for finally calling me by my first name. I hope your son has an awesome junior prom?
Yeah, thank you. It's his junior prom. That's one of the reasons why I had to be here and not with all of you. I'm gonna scooch out to this and go take some pictures and embarrass him with his, prom date, as a good father would. So yes, it is.
So that is your job. So thank you. Wish him fun. Enjoy the photos, and thank you very much for being here, Josh.
No, thank you, Joe. Appreciate you all very much, and Meliora.